Listen to the chatter up in the canopy of this gum tree. It's an ironbark, an Australian eucalypt, covered in flower. It's hard to see the birds, for they are small and green, camouflaged amongst the leaves. From the chatter, I know these are lorikeets. Lorikeets are small birds, and the primary colour of all lorikeets is green. This lorikeet has a little flash of red. That immediately tells us that it's either a little or musk lorikeet. See how there is also red behind the eye? That tells us this is a musk lorikeet. Photographing at a water point in the bush, we can see this line of musk lorikeets. But wait, the one on the left has an orange bill. A scaly-breasted lorikeet, joining with the musks for a drink. Watch as they bend their heads down. Some of the birds have a bluish colour to the cap. These are the mature birds. The immature birds have persistence of the green on the cap. Lorikeets, though they are small birds, can fly very fast. They have a high metabolic rate, and for this they need adequate carbohydrates. The sugary nectar from these eucalypt flowers is the main source of energy for these birds, and they glean the nectar from the eucalypt flowers with their feathery tongues. This bird out in a limb is licking the flowers, but not very fast. When the blossom is very dense, these birds can lick flowers at 3 per second, feeding mostly of a morning and evening, and like all lorikeets, when they're not feeding, they are either at play or roosting. They are very communal birds, and when feeding and flying, they constantly chatter in their parrot fashion. I suspect this chatter gives rise to a group intelligence, which helps in their foraging ability. It is also thought that the visual acuity of these birds is excellent, so when they fly over the canopy, they can pick out trees that have blossom. Watching them feed, notice that it is largely visual. I don't think the sense of smell has anything to do with locating the blossom. When these birds are roosting, they can be very quiet and difficult to find. But they are always very inquisitive, particularly at tree hollows, and often there is a family group effect. Here you can see the two birds on the right preening the head of each other. Watch now for the bluish head on these birds as they feed. As I mentioned, the bluish head is a sign of an adult. Picking a male from a female is far more difficult, but it is said that the female has less intense saturation in the reds and blues, and the green is flatter. I suspect that avicultural people can pick this better with a bird in the hand, but looking through a pair of binoculars, it is far more difficult than what the books describe, and sometimes I think I can pick a female. But then I look again, and I suspect that I am looking at a bird in molt. Just look at this intense cerulean head. The binomial name for the musk lorikeet is Glossopseta consina, or hairy-tongued parrot, most beautiful. The name musk comes from the sweet odour they eliminate. This is intensified in breeding mode. Now a cerulean head, but more to the grey cerulean than the brilliant colours we've just seen. This is probably a female. The first written description of the musk lorikeet was in 1791. This was done at the British Museum from a specimen sent from Sydney. However, I suspect the first written identification of this bird goes back to Captain Phillip, who in his journals when he first came to Australia described in 1780 the Pacific parakeet. He then did a nice little watercolour, which I have included in the insert, and as you can see, this is for all purposes a musk lorikeet. Captain Phillip attributed the naming of this bird to John Latham, so the naming was probably a little bit earlier than what's traditionally observed. In the early 1900s, when Matthews published his book on Australian birds, he included a letter from one of his childhood friends who lived in the Hunter Valley. A Mr. Austin wrote to him and described the birds arriving there in the early part of the year, in their thousands. Interestingly, he never saw them drinking, and very few of them nested in the local tree hollows. The reason for this is that lorikeets feed on nectar, particularly in the morning when the dew is on the flower, and as they extract the sugar, they get a good fluid content as well. However, in the early part of this video, you will notice that I did have musk lorikeets on a perch at a water point. It was an extremely hot day. They drank very quickly, but it is most unusual to see these birds drinking. As to his comments on the nests, these birds are migratory. They flock using group intelligence for food gathering. But breeding is more of an individual task for a pair of birds, and the breeding of the whole flock will take place over several months. So as they migrate around for the blossom, it's unusual to find birds breeding in a large group at one site. In this last clip you can see a group of musk lorikeets having a little bit of a dispute. It's unusual for this to happen, for they bond for life, so fighting for a mate is never a problem. So it may well be that this is just a group of young lorikeets at play. The other option is that there is another group of lorikeets that have come in and intermingled with this local group, and they now regard them as being a threat to their food source. To understand more about the feeding and habits of the lorikeets, please view the video Lorikeets of Australia. On behalf of Plumes of Oz, thank you for watching this video, and if you'd like to be notified of the next release, just hit the bell and subscribe to this channel.